said he was too soft with kids, found his packed bags and a custody letter. Hello, Reddit. My name is Claire, and I'm a 32-year-old stay-at-home mom to 3 wonderful children. There's Lily, my oldest, who's 8 and already thinks she knows everything. Emma, my little spitfire of a 5-year-old, and Max, my baby boy who just turned 3 and still thinks the world revolves around me. My kids are my everything, but I'm terrified I might lose them because of me, my mistakes, my stupidity. My life feels like it's falling apart, and I don't even know where to start picking up the pieces. My husband, David, has always been the steady one, the rock in our family. He's the kind of man who doesn't just love his kids, he lives for them. I can't count the number of times I've come into the living room to find him on the floor surrounded by dolls, crayons, or building blocks, completely absorbed in whatever imaginary world the kids have roped him into. He's the dad who bakes cookies with them on rainy afternoons, makes pancakes shaped like dinosaurs on weekends, and always reads an extra bedtime story, no matter how tired he is. He's the kind of father I know most women would kill to have for their kids. And I know I should feel lucky, blessed even, but instead, I let it get to me. I let it irritate me, and I hate myself for it. You see, David is soft. He's patient to a fault, always willing to talk things out with the kids when they misbehave. If Max throws a tantrum because he wants ice cream before dinner, David will sit with him and explain why he can't have it, stroking his hair until Max calms down. When Lily refuses to do her homework, he doesn't raise his voice or lay down the law. Instead, he'll sit beside her, coaxing her with gentle encouragement until she picks up her pencil. At first, I thought it was sweet. I'd look at him with the kids and think, this is the man I chose to spend my life with. But over time, it started to wear on me. While he was playing the good cop, I was the one enforcing the rules, telling them no, setting boundaries, being the mean mom. And it wasn't just with the kids. David's gentleness extended to everything. When someone cut him off in traffic, he'd shrug it off. When a neighbor let their dog ruin our flower beds, he'd smile and say, "It's not worth getting upset over." I started feeling like I was carrying all the weight. I was the one who had to nag Lily about brushing her teeth, make sure Emma wasn't sneaking snacks before dinner, and pick up after Max's endless trail of toys. And when I'd finally snap and say something like, "Why can't you back me up for once?" David would just look at me with those calm, steady eyes and say, "Claire, they're just kids. They don't need 2 of us coming down on them." It drove me crazy. I started to resent him, even though I knew deep down he was only trying to be the best dad he could be. I'd call him soft during our arguments, sometimes even weak, and I saw how it hurt him. He never yelled back or fought with me. He'd just sit quietly, letting me vent, his hands folded in his lap, his face a mixture of sadness and resignation. Looking back now, I see how unfair I was. I see how I let my own frustrations fester until they poisoned everything good about us. David never deserved that. He's the most patient, loving person I've ever known, but I took his kindness and turned it into something I could blame for everything I was unhappy about. And now I'm paying the price. I just wish I could go back, Reddit. I wish I could take back every cruel word I said, every moment I dismissed his efforts because they didn't match my idea of what they should be. But I can't. And now I'm afraid I've lost him for good. I met David when I was at the lowest point in my life. I was 24, working long hours as a waitress in a dingy little diner downtown. My days were filled with greasy plates, rude customers, and aching feet. My nights weren't much better. I'd just gotten out of a toxic relationship that left me feeling worthless and broken. At that time, the last thing I wanted was to meet someone new. But then, David walked into my life. He came into the diner one evening, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and tie, carrying a leather briefcase. I noticed him right away. Not because he was flashy or loud, but because he seemed so calm, so put together. He sat in my section, ordered a cup of coffee and a BLT, and spent the next hour reading through some papers. When I brought his check, he looked up and smiled at me, and I swear, it was the first genuine smile I'd seen in months. "You work hard," he said, pointing to the coffee stains on my apron. "It suits you." It wasn't a pickup line or anything, just an observation, but it stuck with me. David started coming into the diner more often after that, always sitting in my section, always smiling. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, but then one day he asked for my number. I hesitated. I told him I wasn't in the best place for dating, that I had just gotten out of a bad relationship, but he didn't push. "I'll wait," he said. And he did. Over the next few weeks, David made me feel like I mattered again. He'd text me little jokes to make me laugh during my shifts, or leave a generous tip and a note on the receipt saying, "You're doing great." Slowly, I started to let my guard down. I agreed to go on one date, then another. By the time we'd been seeing each other for 6 months, I couldn't imagine my life without him. David was everything my ex wasn't. Where my ex was unpredictable and cruel, David was steady and kind. He made me feel safe, like I could breathe for the first time in years. When he proposed just a year after we met, I didn't think twice. We got married in a small ceremony with just close friends and family. It was simple and perfect, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like my life was finally on track. We didn't wait long to start a family. David wanted kids right away, and honestly, I thought I did too. But once Lily was born, I realized I wasn't as ready as I thought. Motherhood hit me like a freight train. The sleepless nights, the endless crying, the constant pressure to be perfect, it was overwhelming. David was thrilled, of course. He jumped into fatherhood with both feet, but I struggled. And the more kids we had, the more I felt like I was losing myself. At first, I tried to ignore the little things that bugged me about David's parenting, like how he'd let the kids stay up late if they asked sweetly enough, or how he'd clean up their messes instead of making them do it themselves. "They're just kids," he'd say, whenever I tried to point out that he was being too lenient. "Let them enjoy being little." But over time, it started to wear on me. While David was busy being the fun, playful dad, I was stuck being the enforcer. I was the one telling Lily to clean her room, taking Emma's tablet away when she wouldn't listen, and dragging Max out of the toy aisle at the store while he screamed bloody murder. I felt like the bad guy in my own home. We started fighting about it, not all at once, but in little bursts that grew bigger over time. I'd snap at him, saying things like, "Why do I have to be the only one who says no around here?" Or, "Can't you back me up for once instead of always caving to them?" David never fought back. He'd just sit there calm as ever and say, "We need to talk about this, Claire, not fight about it." But to me, his calmness felt like a cop-out, like he wasn't taking me seriously. And then Josh entered the picture. Josh was one of David's coworkers, a senior manager at his accounting firm. David brought him home for dinner one evening, saying he wanted me to meet him. "He's a bit rough around the edges," David had warned me beforehand, "but he's brilliant at what he does." Rough around the edges was an understatement. Josh was loud, confident, and unapologetically brash. He strutted into our house like he owned it, cracking jokes and teasing David about everything from his tie to his gentle dad reputation. At one point during dinner, Josh looked at me and said, "So is David this soft at home too, or just at work?" I forced a laugh, pretending to defend David, but inside I was agreeing with Josh. Yes, David was soft, too soft. After that night, Josh started texting me. At first it was innocent, recommendations for family-friendly events or compliments about the dinner I made, but the tone shifted quickly. "You looked great the other night," he texted me once. "David's a lucky guy." I knew I should have shut it down, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself smiling at his messages, waiting for them even. It felt exciting, like a little spark in my otherwise predictable life. I told myself it was harmless, just a bit of fun. But deep down, I think I knew I was crossing a line. I just didn't care. Not then, anyway. It started small, just a text from Josh asking if I wanted to grab coffee. I didn't think much of it at first. I told David I had some errands to run, left the house, and met Josh in his car. He had already picked up coffee for me, which I thought was sweet, and we just drove around talking about nothing in particular. It felt light and easy, a welcome change from the routine of my daily life. I didn't feel like Mom or Claire, the nagging wife. I just felt like myself for the first time in ages. Eventually, he parked in a quiet corner of a park, and we kept talking. He made comments about how different I was from the other women he knew, how I was wasting my potential being cooped up all the time. I didn't say anything, but his words stayed with me. It was strange to feel seen by someone who wasn't part of my family, someone who didn't just see me as a wife or a mother. Before I even realized what was happening, he leaned in and kissed me. For a moment, I froze. Then I kissed him back. When I got home later that evening, David was in the kitchen making dinner with the kids. They were all laughing, and it should have felt warm and comforting, but instead, I felt like I was standing on the outside looking in. David asked about my errands, and I mumbled something vague. I couldn't look him in the eye. The kiss should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Josh started texting me more often after that. At first, I told myself it was harmless. They were just texts, nothing serious. But then they started to take on a different tone. He'd tell me how amazing I was, how much better I deserved. I knew it was wrong to even entertain the thought, but I liked the way it made me feel. For once, I wasn't the bad guy or the person everyone relied on to hold it together. I was desirable. I was fun. I started making excuses to see him. A quick run to the grocery store turned into hours away from home. Trips to pick up things we didn't even need became a regular occurrence. I told myself I deserved it, some excitement, a break from the monotony of being a stay-at-home mom. I began to look at David differently, comparing him to Josh in ways that weren't fair. Josh was confident, assertive, and exciting. David, in contrast, felt boring, predictable, and too gentle. It didn't take long for those meetings to escalate. One afternoon, Josh suggested we go somewhere more private. I didn't say no. We ended up at a cheap hotel on the edge of town. It was the first time I'd been alone with him behind closed doors, and when it was over, I told myself it was just a one-time thing. But it wasn't. It became our routine. Every week, I'd find an excuse to slip away and meet him there. Each time, I told myself it didn't matter. It was just for me. The hotel was nothing special. Just a small, shabby room with thin curtains that barely blocked out the neon glow from the sign outside. The faint smell of cleaning products lingered in the air, mixed with something musty that spoke of the countless stories this room had already held. The bedspread was rough against my fingertips, the colors faded and dull, but none of it mattered. For those few hours, I wasn't a wife, a mother, or the keeper of an unraveling life. I wasn't responsible for anyone but myself. In that room, I could shed the weight of my world, even if only temporarily. Josh had a way of commanding attention, even in silence. His movements were confident, deliberate, like he knew exactly what I needed before I did. When his fingers brushed against my arm, it sent a shiver through me, not from the touch itself, but from the way it made me feel noticed, wanted. It was something I hadn't felt in years, and I craved it like oxygen. He cupped my face, his hands rough but firm, tilting my chin just enough to meet his gaze. His eyes were intense, unrelenting, as though he was searching for something buried deep inside me. My breath hitched when his thumb brushed over my cheek, slow and deliberate. It was such a small gesture, but it lit something inside me, a spark that had long since dimmed. I leaned into him, my body responding instinctively, betraying every rational thought screaming at me to stop. When his lips met mine, it was like flipping a switch. The kiss wasn't gentle or tentative. It was hungry, almost desperate, and I matched it with an intensity I didn't know I had. His hands explored my body with a confidence that made me feel powerless and powerful all at once. He didn't ask, he took, and I let him because, for the first time in years, I wanted to be taken. I wanted to feel alive, to drown in something that wasn't responsibility or routine. Every touch, every kiss, every stroke, and every whispered breath against my skin felt like a revelation. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears, drowning out the part of me that knew this was wrong. His fingers traced lines across my body, igniting sensations I hadn't felt in so long I'd almost forgotten they existed. I gasped when his hand slid lower, his touch firm and insistent, coaxing sounds from me I hadn't made in years. My mind was blank, my body completely given over to the moment, to him. For a while, nothing else existed. No guilt, no consequences, no family waiting at home. It was just the two of us in that small, shabby room, caught up in something that felt both dangerous and intoxicating. And when it was over, as I lay there catching my breath, reality started creeping back in. The thrill, the rush, the fleeting escape, it all began to fade, leaving only the gnawing weight of guilt. I told myself I wouldn't come back, that this was a one-time thing. But even then, I knew I was lying to myself. The thrill was addictive, and I was already craving more. At home, though, the guilt started creeping in. It wasn't a sharp, immediate guilt. It was slow, like a shadow growing over everything. I began to notice little things about David, the way he always asked how my day was, the way he still reached for my hand when we sat on the couch together. Instead of appreciating it, I started resenting him. His kindness felt like a reminder of everything I was betraying. I began to pick fights over the smallest things, snapping at him for leaving dishes in the sink or letting the kids stay up too late. I convinced myself it was his fault I felt so trapped, so unfulfilled. If he were different, stronger, more assertive, maybe I wouldn't need Josh. The affair started to take over my life in ways I didn't expect. I stopped paying attention to the things that used to matter to me. I forgot about Lily's school play until David reminded me the morning of. I told him I couldn't make it, that I had an appointment I couldn't reschedule. He didn't argue, just said she'd be disappointed, but that he'd record it for me. That night, when Lily proudly showed me her costume and told me about her performance, I could barely meet her eyes. It wasn't just the play. I missed Emma's soccer game because I was too busy meeting Josh at the hotel. I forgot Max's preschool parent-teacher meeting entirely. David started picking up the slack without a word of complaint, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. He stopped asking me for help, stopped sharing the little moments of his day with me. There was a distance between us that hadn't been there before, and I knew it was my fault. The kids started to notice too. Emma asked me one night why I wasn't at her game. I told her I'd been busy, and she just nodded quietly before running off to play. Max clung to David more than he did to me, and Lily stopped asking me to help with her homework. I told myself it wasn't that bad, that I could still fix things, but every time I left to see Josh, I knew I was pulling further away from the life I'd built. Looking back, I don't know how I justified it. I told myself I was balancing it all, but the truth was I wasn't. I was failing my husband, my kids, and myself, and deep down, I think I knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. Looking back, I think David's suspicions began long before I realized. At first, I thought I was being careful. I'd come home from seeing Josh, take a quick shower, and act like everything was normal. But there were small details I didn't account for, things David noticed, even if he didn't say anything right away. One evening, I came home late and David hugged me goodnight as usual. I could tell something was different from the way he lingered, almost hesitant, before pulling away. I didn't think much of it until later, when I realized I hadn't masked the faint scent of Josh's cologne. From that moment on, it felt like David was watching me more closely. He began asking where I'd been, casually at first, but with a tone that made my stomach twist. Whenever he asked, I became defensive. I accused him of being distrustful and controlling, as if turning it back on him would make the questions stop. It worked for a little while, or so I thought, but his calm reactions, his lack of argument, made me uneasy. He wasn't accusing me outright, but his silence felt heavy, like he was piecing something together and waiting for the right moment. One evening, I left my phone on the kitchen counter while I went upstairs to shower. Normally, I was meticulous about locking it, but I was distracted and forgot. When I came back down, I noticed David sitting at the table, his expression blank but tense. He stood up as I entered, leaving my phone on the counter without a word. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, and my heart started racing. When I picked up the phone, my stomach dropped. The screen was still open to my messages with Josh, plans for our next meeting, flirty exchanges, and things I knew I should never have written. It was all there. I didn't need to ask if David had seen them. His quiet demeanor and the way he left the room without speaking were all the confirmation I needed. I tried to convince myself that maybe he hadn't seen everything, that I could still explain it away if he confronted me, but a pit was forming in my stomach, and I knew deep down that he had seen enough. My hands were shaking as I locked the phone and set it down, but I couldn't bring myself to follow him or ask what he was thinking. David didn't say anything about the messages that night, or the next. At first, I thought maybe he was letting it go, but his behavior began to change in subtle, deliberate ways. He became more observant, asking questions about my plans and my whereabouts, though always in a calm, neutral tone. He stopped leaving his phone around the house and started keeping a notebook in his bag, jotting things down when he thought I wasn't looking. There were other signs, too. I began noticing unfamiliar cars parked on our street or across from the house at odd hours. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening behind the scenes. I later realized he had hired someone to follow me, to gather evidence of what I had been doing. A week later, everything came crashing down. I came home late one evening, having spent the afternoon with Josh. The house was dark except for the living room, where David was sitting on the couch, his suitcase by the door. The moment I walked in, I felt the weight of his silence. The kids were already asleep upstairs, and the quiet of the house only made the tension worse. He didn't get up when I entered. Instead, he motioned toward the coffee table, where a manila envelope was sitting. My heart sank as I picked it up and opened it. Inside were photographs, pictures of me with Josh at the hotel, me getting into his car, me kissing him in broad daylight. I felt like the floor was falling out from under me as I flipped through them, my hands trembling. Beneath the photos was a legal document. It was a custody petition. David had prepared everything. He was leaving, and he was taking the kids with him. He had documented everything, my lies, my absences, my neglect of the family, all laid out in black and white. There was nothing I could say to deny it. He left that night. There was no yelling, no dramatic argument. He simply picked up his suitcase and walked out the door, leaving me standing in the living room with the envelope still in my hands. The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound echoed through the empty house. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the photos, the papers, the evidence of everything I had done. In that moment, I realized the full extent of what I had lost. My husband, my family, my life as I knew it. It was all slipping away, and there was no one to blame but myself. When David walked out that night with his suitcase and the kids, I felt like my entire world had been ripped away. I stood in the empty living room for what felt like hours, clutching the envelope he had left behind, unable to process what had just happened. The silence in the house was deafening. It was the first time in years I couldn't hear the sound of my children laughing, crying, or even just breathing in their sleep. The emptiness was unbearable. I didn't sleep that night. I kept pacing the house, texting and calling David over and over. At first I tried apologizing, pouring my heart into every message, begging him to give me another chance. When he didn't respond, my desperation turned to pleading. I sent him dozens of texts, promising to change, promising to do anything if he would just come back. But the messages all stayed unread. Every call went straight to voicemail. It felt like screaming into a void. The next morning, I drove to his sister's house, where I knew he'd taken the kids. I parked in her driveway, rehearsing what I was going to say, thinking if I could just see him, he'd understand how sorry I was. But when I knocked on the door, his sister answered, and her expression said it all. She didn't invite me in. Instead, she told me it wasn't a good time and that I should leave. I tried to argue, to tell her I needed to see David, but she wouldn't budge. She said she was doing what was best for the kids. When she closed the door, I felt a new wave of panic. It wasn't just David who was shutting me out, it was everyone. The next day, a courier delivered the custody papers to my doorstep. Seeing my name at the top, alongside the words sole custody, made my heart sink. David wasn't just angry, he was serious. He was cutting me out of their lives entirely. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even finish reading the document. It was as though everything I had taken for granted was crumbling before my eyes, and I had no one to blame but myself. As if things weren't bad enough, Josh showed up unannounced later that afternoon. When I opened the door, he strolled in like he owned the place, grinning as if this was all some kind of joke. He made a sarcastic comment about how David must have finally found out, and how it was only a matter of time. His casual tone made my skin crawl. I told him to leave, but he just smirked and said he was here to help me through the divorce. I realized then how little I actually meant to him. To Josh, I wasn't a person. I was a conquest, something to brag about. When I told him I wanted to end things, his demeanor changed. He laughed at first, then got angry, saying I had no right to cut him off after everything we'd done. That's when he told me he had photos, explicit photos, and threatened to send them to David if I tried to push him away. I felt trapped all over again, stuck in the mess I had created. That was the moment I realized just how badly I had misjudged Josh. He wasn't the exciting, confident man I had convinced myself he was. He was cruel and manipulative, and I had thrown away my family for him. After Josh left, the house felt even emptier. I sat on the couch, staring at the custody papers and the photographs David had left behind. The weight of what I had done was crushing. I couldn't stop replaying every mistake I had made, every cruel word I had said to David, every time I had chosen Josh over my family. I had told myself that David was too soft, too passive, too predictable. But now I could see that his softness was exactly what made him the perfect partner and father. He was patient, kind, and steady, everything I had taken for granted until it was too late. I tried reaching out to my friends, but most of them had already heard about the affair. Word spreads quickly in our small community, and the judgment was immediate. Some didn't even bother to respond to my messages. Others sent curt replies, saying they didn't think it was appropriate to be in contact anymore. Even my parents, who had always supported me no matter what, made it clear they were disappointed. My mother told me that she couldn't understand how I could do this to David, to the kids. Hearing her say that broke something inside me. I spent days alone in the house, unable to eat, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David walking out the door with the kids, their little hands clutching his as they looked back at me, confused and hurt. I wanted to turn back time, to undo everything, but I knew it was impossible. The damage was done, and I had no one to blame but myself. For the first time, I felt the full weight of my actions, not just the betrayal, but the ripple effect it had on everyone around me. I had hurt David, the man who had loved me unconditionally. I had let down my children, who deserved better than a mother who couldn't put them first. And now I was alone, drowning in the consequences of my own choices. Update. Hey everyone, so the worst has finally happened. A few days after David left, I was served with legal papers. The courier handed them to me at the door, and I just stood there for a moment, unable to move, as if holding the envelope was enough to burn my hands. Inside, it was all spelled out in stark black and white. David was filing for full custody of the kids. The document outlined everything: the affair, my absences, my erratic behavior. It even included detailed logs from a private investigator and copies of the photographs. Every lie I'd told, every time I'd put Josh above my family, was laid bare. My lawyer didn't mince words when I showed her the documents. She told me straight up that this was going to be a losing battle. Between the photos, the text messages, and David's spotless reputation as a devoted father, I didn't have much of a case. I tried to argue, saying I wasn't a bad mother, that I loved my kids and would do anything for them, but she reminded me that actions spoke louder than words. And my actions over the last few months painted a picture I couldn't undo. I still filed a response. I couldn't just give up without a fight, even though I knew deep down that I didn't stand a chance. Every meeting with my lawyer, every new piece of evidence that David's legal team brought forward felt like another nail in the coffin. By the end, even my lawyer's optimism faded. "You need to prepare yourself for the possibility that you won't get custody," she said. Those words hit me like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't just the legal battle that made life unbearable. Word about the affair spread like wildfire in our small community. At first I noticed the subtle glances, the way people seemed to lower their voices when I walked by. Then it became more blatant. Parents at the kids' school started avoiding me. Invitations to birthday parties and playdates stopped coming. Even the cashier at the grocery store, who used to chat with me about our kids, suddenly became distant. One day I overheard two moms whispering about me in the school parking lot. They didn't even try to hide it. One of them said she couldn't imagine how a mother could do something so selfish, and the other said she hoped David got full custody. I wanted to scream, to defend myself, but I couldn't. What could I say? They weren't wrong. Then Josh made everything worse. After I cut him off, he decided to retaliate in the cruelest way possible. He posted screenshots of our text conversations on social media, messages where I complained about David, where I talked about sneaking around to meet him. The screenshots spread like wildfire. Friends, neighbors, even distant acquaintances saw them. The comments were brutal. People called me every name in the book, questioning my morals, my fitness as a mother, and even my intelligence for getting involved with someone like Josh. I stopped going out altogether. Every trip to the store or the school felt like walking into a room full of people who knew every one of my darkest secrets. I couldn't face the judgment, the whispers, the pitying looks. I barely left the house except for meetings with my lawyer or to drop off paperwork. Update. Hey Reddit, this is my last post here. So, the final blow came when I decided to try one last time to fix things with David. I knew it was a long shot, but I couldn't let it end like this. I drove to his sister's house, the same house where he'd taken the kids after leaving. I stood outside for a long time before finally knocking on the door. His sister answered, her face carefully neutral, and called for David. When he came to the door, the look on his face nearly broke me. He looked tired, like all of this had worn him down in ways I hadn't even considered. I begged him to listen, to hear me out. I told him I was sorry for everything, that I knew I'd made terrible mistakes, but I didn't want to lose my family. I promised to go to therapy, to do whatever it took to make things right. He let me talk, standing there in silence, his expression unreadable. When I finally stopped, he looked at me and said something I'll never forget. He said it wasn't about him anymore. It was about the kids, and they deserved better than what I had given them. I could feel the weight of those words crushing me. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even sad. He had moved beyond that, to a place where he was just done. I watched as he turned and walked back into the house. Lily and Emma came running to him, their little hands reaching for his. Max was in the background, clutching a toy, looking at me with confused, uncertain eyes. And then the door closed. I stood there for a long time staring at the door, knowing it was over. David wasn't going to forgive me. The kids weren't going to come home with me. The life I had built, the family I had taken for granted, was gone. Now, I sit in this empty house, trying to piece together where it all went wrong. I know the answer, of course. It went wrong with me. My choices, my selfishness, my inability to appreciate what I had. I've lost my husband, my children, my reputation, and my sense of self. I don't know if I'll ever get any of it back. Reddit, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need to ask, how do I move forward from here? How do I live with the weight of what I've done? Or is this the punishment I'll carry for the rest of my life? This all could have been avoided if I had just communicated, if I had valued what I had, instead of chasing something I thought I was missing. I know that now. I see it too late. And now, I've lost everything that ever truly mattered to me. Please, if you're reading this and you see yourself in my story, stop. Don't make the same mistakes I did. Don't let boredom or dissatisfaction cloud your judgment. Don't take the people you love for granted. Talk to them, work with them, fight for them before it's too late. Because once it's gone, once they're gone, you'll never forgive yourself. Reddit, I know I'm the villain of this story, but is there any way to fix what I've broken? Or is it too late for me?